Thank you all for coming. It's for me a privilege and an honor to be here to talk to you about what its promoters are calling the next big thing in the digital world, and that's the cloud and big data. Now, I knew nothing about the cloud until I sat down one, I think it was February, Sunday to tune in the Super Bowl. And like many people, I watch the football game, but really care about the commercials. And I think it was at halftime that an ad appeared with a cartoon animation featuring the Black Eyed Peas, advertising for this thing called the cloud. It was sponsored by a company I hadn't heard of. I know a lot about now, Salesforce.com. But the cloud, the Peas were talking about uploading their music to this thing called the cloud and making their lives more efficient, effective, and the band more profitable. There were two commercials. Salesforce paid big money that day to get the word out, and I heard the word and thought I'd look into it some more. And the more I looked into it, the more important I felt it was. And as I probed more deeply, recognized that there were significant problems associated with the cloud. So today I'm going to talk about what it means to be lost in the cloud. I mean that term in two senses. I don't know if anybody can identify that, the painting that's the backdrop for my title.
Magritte?
It's Magritte, yes. Do you know? It's called Empire of Light. And Magritte is someone who has inspired me on a number of occasions. I love his work with clouds, and this is a surreal rendition of daylight in the sky and nighttime on the ground. I sometimes feel surreal in examining cloud computing because what's called the cloud is so very different from what appears to us in our image of the white puffy things in the sky. Our clouds are immaterial, sublime, ineffable. We love clouds, unless you happen to be an astronomer. Clouds get in the way for those folks. But the cloud and cloud computing, as we'll see, is an enormous factory, warehouse, ponderous, every inch material. And we'll talk some about the consequences of that. So there's a strange kind of feeling in talking about clouds and observing, visiting these massive structures that are part of the network of the future of communication in the world today. Many people have looked at the cloud, have actually gotten lost in it as well. When I began my research, 2011-12, I came to recognize that most of what was written and is still being written about cloud computing is by and large technical and promotional. It's there to advance largely a corporate or a government mission. So there is an enormous promotional movement in advertising, social media, business fairs and exhibitions to advance the cause of the cloud. I decided then to take seriously the project of writing this book, in part to offer a critical alternative. I recognized that there were big problems with the cloud and big data, and that we needed to pay closer attention to these problems. Now, perhaps in keeping with the growing commercialization of the university, I'm going to begin with a couple of commercials of my own. This one gave rise to the title of the book, and it's one of my favorites because it's both humorous and perverse at the same time. So perverse that the protest in response to this ad, a Microsoft ad, led Microsoft to pull all versions of it from the internet, which sent me on a chase to find the copy. here it is, to the cloud.
Okay, so we've got Jen texting, Cody sticking an action figure into Hunter's ear, and Joe, what are you doing?
Trying to get the action figure out of Hunter's ear.
To the cloud. Now I can take all these unruly shots and swap in some smiles. Finally, a photo I can share without ridicule. Windows gives me the family nature never could.
To the cloud with Windows Live to create and share anywhere.
It's a pretty extraordinary statement, isn't it? Windows gives me the family nature never could. Here she has her normal family behaving or misbehaving depending on your values. And they're just inappropriate for a genuine family photo, so she goes to the cloud to find the right images for her family. I could spend a lecture deconstructing this ad, the image of Mom the witch, the husband whose head sinks into his arms at the thought that Windows gave her the family nature never could, etc. But a group in the UK went me one better with a satirical rendition of that ad.
Okay, so we've got Jen texting, George being George, and Joe.
I was trying to stop George from being George.
To the cloud. Now I can take all these rubbish shots and just swap in some smiles. Finally, a photo I can share without embarrassment. Windows gives me the family nature never could.
Removing and faking memories with Windows Live. Your life is shit, so make it bland.
Shaming your idiosyncrasies. Your life is shit, so make it bland. I thought that captured it very well. I'm going to start by giving you a kind of bold theme for this lecture. So if you're thinking, what is Professor Mosco getting at? Here it is, straight up, and I'll spend the rest of the lecture describing in some detail what it all means. Now, not easy to see. There may be some reflection. I don't know if we can change the lighting in some way. Can you see the screen from the back? Is it clear enough? Oh, good. Now, some people will say that the cloud really is about nude celebrity photos. Kate Upton, Jennifer Lawrence made the mistake of putting their photos in Apple's iCloud and are now embarrassed, or if they, as some suspect, engineered it all as a PR scheme, they're benefiting from the publicity. And it's not just about sex tapes, as in the Jason Segel, Cameron Diaz film of that title, where they mistakenly upload an intimate experience to the cloud and mistakenly distribute it from the cloud to all of the people in their family and friendship network. The cloud is more than that, though I appreciate the fact that the cloud is now enough in the news and in popular culture so that people have some basic understanding of what it means. But more broadly, global capitalism and the surveillance state, think CIA, NSA, have built and vigorously promoted cloud computing and big data analytics. The cloud and big data are necessary to sustain chains of accumulation. Those are global networks of businesses that use the cloud. For example, Apple's ability to develop a global supply chain starting in Shenzhen, China, and ending in Cupertino or at its Fifth Avenue store in New York City is an example of a chain of accumulation, beginning with the manufacturing of the devices in a Foxconn plant in Shenzhen based on designs rendered in Cupertino and sold in Apple stores around the world. Companies like Apple, Facebook, certainly Microsoft needed to manage the global division of labor. All businesses now use the cloud to organize, coordinate. Logistics has become an enormous field. Well, logistics is today about using the cloud to manage a transnational corporation. As well, it's important to control the workplace. I'll talk a little bit later about what this means for people like baristas at Starbucks who are feeling the brunt of the cloud and big data today. But it's also important to recognize that chains of accumulation advance chains of resistance. This is not just about big companies and the state dominating our lives. That experience also generates resistance. It's important to think dialectically, the ways in which actions generate reactions. And so these lead to chains of resistance which are essential for creating alternatives. So we'll talk some about what resistance means. But my goal, and probably the primary reason for writing this book, is to generate a debate and a discussion, to be part of a flow of conversation about the need to develop democratically governed public information utilities that reimagine and reinvent Marx's vision of the general intellect. And for those of you who don't know what the general intellect is, it's a concept that Karl Marx developed most fully in his notebooks known as the Grundrisse, which he developed prior to writing Capital. And in there he talks about the general intellect. And in very straightforward terms refers to it as the set of ideas, concepts, information developed by science, engineering, the arts, that a global network of information that he argued belongs to all who have created it. And that we should, in essence, own and control the general intellect. Marx's concern was that ideas and the technologies that generate them were coming to be concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer businesses and a compliant state. And the goal would be to open that narrow control so that people all over the world can control their ideas in a democratic system. So that's kind of the heavy-duty theme that I will unravel some over the course of my talk. Here's the book that contains most of these ideas and that I continue to work on because I'm moving toward from a book about the cloud to a book about what's being called the Internet of Things that will build on cloud computing. I haven't formally copywritten the title, but don't use this title or I'll come after you. It's called Come Alive, the Internet of Things. Anyway, this is how I designed the cover. My son-in-law offered me an alternative design. I turned it down. He's a sweet guy, and sometimes I feel like the old man yelling at the cloud. But actually, this is what I think about when clouds come to mind, and I think all of us have some image of the cloud. And what makes the study of cloud computing, at least aesthetically, so surreal is that this is what's come to be the cloud. This is a Microsoft data center, and there are thousands of these now all over the world, including in Canada. In fact, Canada has more than its share because, as we'll see, one of the key problems in cloud computing is keeping the data centers powered and the servers that fill data centers cooled. Cooler climates are better for data centers. You save on power. This is what has to be kept cool. These are the thousands and thousands of servers organized in racks. This is a Google data center inside the data center, and this is essentially what's in there. One after another of what amount to computers that are interconnected that store our data, Gmail, process that data, but as well offer their own software apps that companies charge for, charge us to use. So cloud data centers are best identified as factories rather than warehouses, though you'll see the term warehouse, because data centers don't just store data. They are producing value for the companies that own them, and they do so by processing that data, packaging it in different forms, and offering services. So, for example, I mentioned Salesforce earlier. Salesforce wants to be the world's marketing department. So, in essence, if you operate a large corporation which has, say, General Motors, which has a large marketing division, sales division, Salesforce says you can streamline, strip down, or maybe get rid of your entire marketing division by simply hiring us, Salesforce. We will use our store of data and information and our expertise to manage your customer files, to develop systems that can do the marketing for you. So these are more appropriately identified as information factories. Now, this is a cloud city. People say China tends to do things bigger. And so when China develops the cloud, it doesn't just set up data centers, it builds cloud cities. This is a bottom-up cloud city design, which contains data centers, research and development facilities, corporate headquarters, educational facilities, as well as housing, etc. Located in Hebei province. Though China only controls about 3% of the market in cloud computing, it's growing fairly rapidly. So don't be surprised if now or sometime in the near future you learn that your email or health records, for that matter, are being processed in the People's Republic of China. Now imagine, you can begin to gather some of the political implications of this sort of thing. Now, for those of you interested in kind of figuring out how this got to be called cloud computing, briefly, back decades ago, telecommunication engineers who were designing systems for places would establish networks. And the nodes in the networks were drawn for some reason as clouds. So there you have an example of a design of a telecommunication network in Puerto Rico, which links cities to nodes that bring the world to Puerto Rico and bring Puerto Rico to the world. But I think it's more important to see the cloud as one of the most powerful images. So while this is important, what's more important is the significance, the semantic, discursive significance of the cloud as an image. Immaterial, ineffable, sublime. When you think cloud, think that. Making it, I think, more difficult for us to understand the heavy materiality of the cloud and to wrap our minds around its consequences, for example, for the environment. And these are massively significant. So the cloud is kind of a cover, a sublime cover, helping us in a way to feel better, more accepting of systems that are as powerful, weighty material as the factories of the Industrial Revolution. Now, there is an official definition of cloud computing. The story behind the definition is probably as important as the definition itself, which has a lot of bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo. It was developed, of course, by a US government agency. The US government has been promoting the cloud for a number of years, and its chief cheerleader was the Chief Information Officer of the United States government. It's interesting that the government has a CIO. The title and the job is mainly a corporate position. The person who handles IT is often known as the CIO. Well, the US government has a CIO who early on became a big cloud booster, so much so that he sent out an order to government departments and agencies throughout the United States saying, you have to move your files to the cloud. It'll save us money. Certainly labor costs will go down, make us more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. So take the files in your cabinets, take your IT departments, and shift them all to either government or private contractors who would do cloud services for the government. The response from agency and department heads was, well, what is this cloud you're telling us to move to? They had no idea what cloud computing was. It's been such a new development that the CIO for the government decided, well, maybe we need a definition so that people will understand. I mean, this is the way government works. An order goes out, do something. People say, well, I have no idea what it is you want me to do. Well, then let's go back to the drawing board and develop a definition. Now, when you boil it all down, cloud computing involves systems that take your information, data, audio, video files, software, apps, and the same from a large corporate conglomerate like Exxon. So your computer or the computers in the data centers of a giant corporation, and uploads them to a data center that is part of a global network of data centers. And the companies that operate cloud computing facilities then use that information, store it, and charge you by the use. So, for example, you've learned if you use a service like Dropbox, for example, you store your data in Dropbox, and it's available to you when you want it, and you don't need to keep copies on your computer, saving storage space. And companies are coming to recognize that there's value for them in moving to the cloud. But again, it's not just about storage. It's, in essence, hiring a company to help you do your business, whether you're an individual or a large company. Now, other definitions are more to the point. This is more bureaucratic. This, I think, is one of the more telling definitions. Cloud computing is nothing more than the next step in outsourcing your IT operations. So when you ask why does a university like York want to move to the cloud? Well, it can, at the very least, streamline, if not eliminate, its IT department. And move your files, your records, et cetera, to the data centers of a cloud company. Now, in fact, I mentioned York in my book because there was an interesting controversy here not too long ago, and it's being replicated all over Canadian universities. York wanted to save money, move to Google's cloud so that you would all be on Gmail, saving labor costs and IT processing locally by having Google do it globally. And then the question arose, where is that data going to be located? And someone figured out, well, I guess in the United States. Well, what does that mean? Well, the United States has a set of laws, including the Patriot Act, the FISA provisions, et cetera, that essentially gives the US government rights to your data that the Canadian government would not have if it were stored here. So if they see you as a threat, they can grab hold of your data and make use of it against you. All this unbeknownst to you. It's just a way to save money. So here's an important sort of consequence of the understandable drive to save costs leads to significant political policy issues. Now, in the course of doing my research, and over the years I've liked to do hands-on work. I a sociologist by trade, and so if I'm studying an industry, I want to go to the industry. And one piece of this was to attend the world's largest cloud computing and big data conference, Cloud Expo 2013. I love the titles for these things. Located in, at one of the world's largest conference centers, the Javits Center in Manhattan. It was a week-long event, and I was kind of the sociologist, anthropologist in the room, taking notes on the culture of the cloud business, getting a sense of the promotional drive behind it, the marketing of cloud services, even following around spokesmodels, which play a very interesting role in the high-tech world that I was not aware of. You know, when you go to a business conference now, and first off, you pay big bucks to do it. I don't want to tell you what it cost me to attend. All right, I will. It was $2,500 for a week. Just to, you know, but, you know, what do we do for research, you know? Anyway, when you do that, you complete an application form that, you know, details everything about you. And what I didn't know, that was embedded in my ID materials that I hung around my neck to get around, to get access to all the sessions. And what spokesmodels do, and they're like from the auto show, scantily clad, walking the floor, chatting up people, but they also carry little wands, which I learned. They would wave in front of your ID materials, uploading everything that you've described about yourself and handing it to the company they work as spokesmodels for. So a week later, I was getting phone calls. Mr. Mosco, are you satisfied with your cloud? You know, and trying to pitch me cloud services. So it's kind of an interesting wrinkle on the kind of modern system of promotion and marketing, a form of surveillance. No one informed me that they would be taking my data, but I recognized by pursuing the question that indeed this is what they were doing. Now, one other vignette from this conference, which is also quite telling, is that I attended as many sessions as I could, including a lunch session with a very enthusiastic MC. Now, unlike academic conferences, when you go to business conferences, amazingly, especially high-tech ones, they play rock music. So the MC is running up to the stage to heavy metal music, and up on the stage, try to picture three gurus in seats, and this was kind of the lunch people are, well, the company that sponsored the lunch session, and there had to be 2,000 people in the room, provided us all with lunch. So there are big bucks involved in this. Everybody got a box with sandwiches, etc. Anyway, there he runs up to the podium, and great enthusiasm turns to one guru and says, "What's the first word that comes to mind when I say cloud computing?" And the first one says profit. And the second one says opportunity, or something like that. And the third one said this. There's always a wrinkle in these events, and it's fascinating to observe them. As I think I mentioned in the book, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Someone had gone off script. And his point was that the cloud has been with us for decades, from the time of time-sharing computing in the 1950s and 60s. We've had something like the cloud where we've stored our data somewhere else. So to see this as revolutionary and transformative is to largely treat it in a promotional sense. Now, this has sparked a debate about whether cloud computing is hype or the next big thing. I do tend to identify with the next big thing, but not for the reasons that its promoters identify. I think it's a big thing because there are big problems associated with it. And our lives are becoming more and more influenced by the cloud, and we need to be aware of these. So again, the interest here is to promote a discussion and a debate about the social implications of this technology, something that hasn't happened to date. In other words, mo data, mo problems. Anybody identify that fellow? He's no longer holding his office. This is General Petraeus, who headed the US command in Iraq for a time, toasting what was the obvious victory. This is an appropriate day to be using this slide, isn't it? Because today, Canada's going to war. And of all places, Iraq. I thought we won that one. No, I guess not. Let's talk about some of the problems associated. One of the first big ones, and kind of the governing concern I have, and I've examined and lived through a lot of the history of certainly modern communication technology. Most communication technologies came with a role for the public in decision making, in regulation, in policy making. Whether it was the postal service or the telegraph, the telephone, broadcasting, telecommunication. We've had systems of regulation because we've recognized that communication is an essential service, essential for all of us. And so we have to have some role. And people have come together to struggle and fight for a role in decision making. And so organizations like the CRTC, for better or worse, are there to help advance the public interest in communication. Well, the cloud has no public role. And this is kind of ironic in that the major form of cloud computing that people talk about, and the one that is led by the major companies like Amazon, the dominant company in cloud computing, is referred to as the public cloud. This is an absolute misnomer. So you will hear reference to a public cloud, a private cloud, and a hybrid cloud that combines elements of both. In this meaning, public refers only to your right to buy cloud services. So in other words, you can send your data to Dropbox or Amazon Web Services. It essentially is a consumer cloud. And it's public in the sense that all the data is kept together in one data center all with the same level of security, and the charge for the storage and processing is relatively the same across users. The private cloud is a cloud system that is kind of like a gated community, right? So you pay more money to put your data in a private cloud, and you buy more security, less contamination with other people's data. So security conscious people and businesses who have the wherewithal to pay more put it into private cloud systems. But the key here is that there is no role for the public. And part of my interest in cloud computing is to argue for the need for a public role, in part because, although it's new, cloud computing is increasingly controlled by a handful of corporations that dominate the market, the leading one being Amazon. Amazon is everywhere. Walmart is small potatoes compared to Amazon. Well, maybe not small potatoes, medium-sized potatoes. Amazon is arguably the dominant force in the information age. It's everywhere. It was in my taxi as I was coming up here this morning. I'm checking my news services, and there's a story. There are pickets outside the Washington Post this morning. Why? Because Jeff Bezos decided he wanted to own one of the major newspapers in the world, the Washington Post, and he bought it. Bezos is the head of Amazon. So Amazon now owns the Washington Post. Bezos is a conservative libertarian. And what he's doing is turning the dominant newspaper in the US Capitol into a megaphone for conservative libertarian causes. He's replaced his publisher, And he's at the same time attacking the unions that represent workers at the Washington Post, wants to make the Post union-free, as are almost all Amazon facilities, enabling him to control labor costs and workplace processes. Now, ironically, I say ironically, but you know, the world is full of ironies. Amazon is a close friend of the Obama administration. In fact, Amazon is given probably the most credit of any outside organization for the re-election of Barack Obama in 2012 because its cloud service, Amazon Web Services, was responsible for all data management, voter identification for the Obama campaign. As we all know, Barack Obama was enormously successful, far more successful than Mitt Romney's data company, not one of the majors, and one that in fact failed to get the turnout that Amazon provided. Now, some might suggest that Amazon was well rewarded for this effort because about a year ago, maybe a bit longer now, it was given a $600 million contract to provide cloud and big data services to the Central Intelligence Agency. And just 2 weeks ago, the CIA flipped the switch and now operates its cloud services in concert with Amazon. And there's some real opposition to this, but what it represents for me is a certain marriage, as it were, between what we might call digital capitalism represented by Amazon, a dominant force in the global information industry, and the surveillance state. Amazon and the CIA are in bed together now. This is a significant, this is a very significant development in, for the entire digital world, but particularly for cloud computing and big data. Well, some might suggest, well, if Amazon's good at their business and dominate the market, shouldn't they have the right to do that? Well, I mean, one can make that case, but you'd be wrong. Amazon, like other conglomerates, controls so many different markets that it's able to use what is either, depending on your point of view, a time-honored or a time-dishonored practice of what's called predatory pricing. And that essentially means using revenues that it generates in all of its other holdings, from selling books to selling Cheerios online. And I do have another son-in-law who buys Cheerios through Amazon Prime. It wasn't until I stayed with him and my daughter that, you know, I would see a truck come up every other day and deliver his large box of Cheerios. I mean, Amazon will deliver anything. You know, the delivery was free through Amazon Prime, so he had his Cheerios delivered. Likes Cheerios, what can I say? Amazon's able to use revenues generated by its other business streams to undercut the cloud pricing of most of the rest of the industry, though it's in a fight now with Google, especially, and Microsoft. But they're driving the price of the cloud down, forcing companies like Dropbox and other of the smaller ones. Rackspace is a big one, but it's up against the ropes now, and in fact is looking for a buyer. It's a company that has had hundreds of thousands of employees and is still doing reasonably well, but it expects that Amazon and a couple of the other usual suspects, Google, Microsoft, will likely drive it either out of business or into a niche. So there's growing concentration at the top of the cloud industry, mainly Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Apple and Facebook are in there, so I say usual suspects. Some of the old timers are struggling to get into the cloud, like IBM, Cisco, Hewlett Packard. These are firms that made big money by selling hardware and did very well for many years. But they're recognizing now that the money to be made is not in hardware or even in software to a degree, it's largely in services. So if Salesforce can be your marketing company, Where does that leave the IBM people who want to sell you hardware for your IT center? You know, and you tell your IBM salesperson, well, sorry, we don't have an IT center anymore. We've uploaded it to the cloud. So IBM and others are scurrying to get into the cloud. Now, what's also troubling about the marriage of Amazon and the CIA is the role of the NSA in this, and this is a story from Wired called Inside the Matrix. The National Security Agency, an organization that we now are pretty well all familiar with, thanks to the revelations of Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald writing brilliantly for the Guardian newspaper and others. The NSA is building one of the world's largest cloud data centers in what they consider an impregnable fortress in a mountain in Utah, with fencing that they claim will keep out, you know, a truck going at 50 miles an hour. And they apparently done the testing. No one will get into the NSA's cloud. So these are the kind of dominant forces. And again, you ask, well, where's the public? Well, you know, the public either doesn't even know what the cloud is, or when they hear about it, you know, well, they may hear about Jennifer Lawrence, but what else? Is there a role? Should we be involved in this? Now, this becomes even more important when we consider some other problems, like the environmental consequences of the cloud. Again, this is not the immaterial, ineffable, sublime, puffy whiteness in the sky. This is a very material and technology that requires massive amounts of electricity. The estimates are it now drains about 3% of the global grid. It's hard to say, you know, precisely, but this is growing. The cloud computing's in its early days. So there are huge power demands. Now, you know, we all want 24/7 access. So that means that companies have to have backup systems at work that they can use when the grid goes down. And most of these are heavily polluting. Diesel generators that spew carcinogens into the air. I describe in the book a case in the state of Washington, in the United States, where Microsoft, which has headquarters in Washington, came to a small town and said, you know, we're moving in, we're a green technology, and found it cheaper to use diesel rather than electricity. And it was some enterprising investigators realized that the level of carcinogens spewing out of their generators was dangerous. And given that an elementary school was located nearby the data center, serious problems for the children, families in the town. Now, you know, the town had no idea. This is a cloud. You know, is it going to be a problem? Well, yes, a serious problem. Diesel generators are backups. Chemical batteries, lead acid batteries, not the ones you put in your radio, but giant ones, are used as backup. There are all sorts of backup systems that are required because, you know, neither you nor I will tolerate downtime. What do you mean I can't get access to my email? I want it, and I want it now. Well, so we participate in this as well. And furthermore, you know, it's not just the kind of the power drain to keep the servers going. As I mentioned earlier, they have to be kept cool. So we need air conditioning in all of these giant factories, which drains further power. Now, some companies are beginning to respond to protests, and there is resistance coming from organizations like Greenpeace, and even from artists like Tommy Cotil, who is an installation artist who is using her art to display what Greenpeace does in its research to ask, how green is your cloud? And she has documented in her art data centers, and in essence, she darkens the clouds to the level that Greenpeace identifies is appropriate for a particular company. Now, a few companies are doing better using solar power. Apple and Microsoft are doing a bit better. Again, come back to Amazon. Amazon, I mean, it's a libertarian-driven company, and it believes that it has the right to use its data centers in whatever way it chooses. It will not reveal any data on its power use, on its pollution, and will not adjust in any way to demands made by organizations to produce cleaner power at their data centers. Now, I mean, again, the others have made adjustments, but the pollution continues to rise as a result of the growth in global networks of cloud computing. Now, in addition to the environmental consequences, people have suggested that we're in the civil rights fight of the information age right now around privacy and surveillance issues. So think, you put your data in some distant storage facility, a company gets that data, or the government gets that data. What rights do they have to it? Well, absent a public role in policymaking and decision-making, you essentially give up most of your rights when you let go your data. Oh yeah, I mean, every nation has its own legal regime, but you don't even know what nation your data is stored in. So it is a fight equivalent to civil rights battles in the 1960s over race, over gender. Now it's over the right to our identity. Now, much of the emphasis, this is one of my favorite slides. I'd love to see a hacker rising through the clouds with his balaclava ready for criminal activity. He's up to no good. And this is part of the ideology of the invasion of privacy issue. Most of the attention goes to hackers. So, you know, if you don't want your nude photos hacked, it's blame the hacker. Track them down, criminalize it. But what's often forgotten, and you know, let's recognize hacking is a serious issue, and most cloud companies haven't a clue about how to provide the kind of protection we would all need. I mean, Apple wants to sell you an iWatch that will draw all of your health information, and it can't preserve the photographs of people who upload to iPhoto from the hands of, you know, relatively amateurish hackers. So what happens when you buy your iWatch and you store all of your blood pressure, etc., eventually DNA, in the data centers of a company like Apple that can't guarantee security for what are considerably banal issues today? So we blame the hackers. It's a serious issue, but there's a larger issue, and that's essentially that it's built into the business plans of cloud companies that they will profit through surveillance. The point is, we don't need hackers to take your identity. Once you upload, whether it's posting on Facebook or storing your data or buying cloud services, you are in essence offering your identity. Why? Because it's valuable to companies, some of whom, most of whom, market that data to advertisers. And you know, some of it is, some of the advertising is irrelevant. You can just kind of skim over it. But there are some cases that are so troubling to me, including one of a person I knew, a young person who was diagnosed with cancer, decided to tell her friends, through our Facebook friends, about the issue once she had come to terms with it, and soon thereafter began receiving ads for bucket lists, telling this 29-year-old that this company will help you do the few things you have time left to do in your life. Is that what we bargained for with any of these services? Now, you might say that's an extreme case, but as long as your identity is valuable and the more data, the more value, that will continue to be and will grow as a pervasive problem. Furthermore, of course, there is the role of the state in the cloud and big data. So it's not just the businesses that profit, it's the CIA and the NSA, which, I mean, in essence, and I've been observing the NSA now for 50 years. I first read about it in the 1960s, read James Bamford's wonderful investigative work on it. So it's quite familiar to me. I worked in Washington for a time and kept an eye on both it and the CIA, and had some privileged access that worried me. But now it's absolutely out of control because we have the technologies that will enable the NSA to know pretty well everything and to process that data and make use of it in their own ways. And when there are no guarantees that the uses will be appropriate or that they will accurately do their analysis, think of the people who get put on no-fly lists inaccurately because big data has big problems. And that takes me to a concern I have, especially with big data, and that's digital positivism, a term I coined to suggest that there is such euphoria around the potential of big data to understand everything that we are reducing what it means to know things to a kind of two-step process. One, find the numbers. Two, run correlations. And when you do that, as this enthusiast says, writing for Wired magazine, the numbers speak for themselves. So out with theory, out with history, out with sociology, out with qualitative methodologies. You don't have to talk to people. We can assign a number to any objective or indeed subjective state. Strong feeling, weak feeling, 5, 1, right? Who knows why people do what they do? Who cares? The point is they do it and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity, Chris Anderson says. And that's the best definition I know of digital positivism. It means reducing what it means to know to number and correlation. And anyone who's had any training in methodology will tell you correlation is not causality. It simply recognizes an association. And that association may be spurious. There may be many other variables that intervene. But the view here is, well, as long as a couple of things go together, then we need to treat that relationship seriously. And I think it's an enormous mistake. Now, keep in mind that I'm not arguing here against quantitative analysis. I'm a sociologist. I've done a lot of quantitative data analysis over my career, over the course of my career, including some more sophisticated, some less sophisticated. In fact, someone sent me a note, this is a function of age. Back in 1983, I wrote a piece on distinguishing between a critical and a positivist view of research. And the distinction is not over whether you use qualitative data or quantitative data. The distinction is whether you are committed to the value of human emancipation. And that's the distinction between critical and positivist or administrative research, which is essentially research that administers, controls, manages. The point is not whether you use numbers or whether you talk to people. My recommendation is that you do both and as much as possible. A pluralist methodological approach is always the most valuable. But what we're seeing with the arrival of big data, including to the humanities. The only way you really can get a grant to do humanities research in the United States today is through the Office of the Digital Humanities in the US government that funds what amounts to quantitative correlational research on the humanities. How often does Shakespeare use the word heart in his tragedies? And how is that correlated to the use of other words? Now, some people might find this significant. Some people might find this to be a little more than standard academic administrative research. But the point is that even in the humanities, big data is crowding out opportunities to do research that respects history, theory, subjectivity, and the other dimensions that we would broadly consider the remit of a scholar. I have to give credit to my other son-in-law. The first one offered me Old Man Yells at Cloud. The second, well, I'll get to that one. There it is. I'll come back to the Google flu fiasco. I don't know if any of you read XKCD, but Randall Munroe produced a lovely cartoon around correlation and causation when he was angered by a World Health Organization report that using big data documented through correlational studies that there was an association between cell phone use and cancer without reference to potential intervening variables, et cetera. So Randall ran the data. He's a scientist himself who does this very popular cartoon, and came to the conclusion that, in fact, it's probably cancer that causes cell phones, and that's a more appropriate conclusion to be drawn from the UN data. It's laughable, it's ludicrous, but it's serious, as was documented when Google used its big data to try to predict a flu outbreak. Google had the idea that it could beat the Centers for Disease Control in forecasting flu. The CDC takes 2 weeks, maybe 12 days to predict a flu outbreak. Google said, we can do it in 48 hours, 2 days. What was it going to do? It was going to correlate search terms with flu outbreaks. And it found the terms that seemed to predict in advance the spread of a major flu issue. And in the first year it tried it, it was accurate, and it was enthusiastically pursuing this. Unfortunately, in year 2, as one of the leading journals of the scientific community documented in a detailed analysis, Google blew it. In year 2, and any media student could understand why, in year 2, it predicted a major flu outbreaks that never took place. And it did so because its search terms registered spikes at particular points in time. Well, again, as a media student, you would understand that as we become more and more concerned and indeed panicky about flu, we do more searching on Google. And it may be the media itself that generates a good deal of this panic, right? So you watch the news, worry about flu, you see the advertising, you do the searching, and here comes the monstrous flu. Well, Google was just predicting something that the media and Google users had generated. No big flu outbreaks. It blew the forecast. So it's important to understand that big data is not just logically problematic. It can also make enormous mistakes in the use of the methodologies that are significant. You may have heard about the case of OkCupid. Facebook had the same issue. It's tempting, isn't it, when you've got factories full of data to manipulate it. In fact, to revise it, just to see what your users might do. So the dating service OkCupid got playful with its data and sent the wrong, well, in its mind, the right results, but not the accurate results, to people who subscribe to the service. just to see how people would react, carrying out its own experiments, as Facebook has done, using its timeline, etc. We're just fudging the data some, and we want to know, well, if we put more positive material on your timeline, will you come back to Facebook more often? And it turns out it appears to be the case. The correlations are not all that high. But the point is, the temptation to manipulate is significant. And there's a final example that I think is also quite important. These two scholars, one an economist from Harvard, the other with the National Bureau of Economic Research in Washington, high-level economists, produced a big data-generated paper that became the bedrock for the policy we've come to experience rather painfully as austerity. That is, government cutbacks in spending, the drive to balance budgets to eliminate debt. And policymakers, the media, the New York Times ran story after story about Rogoff and Reinhardt, saluting their paper, which found a kind of magic formula. If government debt reaches a certain percentage of annual GDP, national growth will slow. So we have to cut back on debt, on spending. And it was kind of the E equals MC square of economics. And they were feted for their achievement until, and another reason why I loved graduate students, an enterprising doctoral student at UMass Amherst, taking an economics course, decided to write his term paper, kind of doing an analysis of their work. And so he wrote to them and said, can I have a chunk of your data? And they, like most scholars would, agreed once they realized it was going to be used in a seminar. And the student did the analysis and found that there are enormous numbers of mistakes. Spreadsheet errors, countries' data was left out when, and this led some to be quite suspicious, did not conform to the formula. There were issues of interpretation of the evidence, using correlations to suggest causalities that might not work. The point was, their research was fundamentally flawed. So honored as they were as the gurus of austerity. Now what this suggests to me are a couple of things. First of all, it's hard to find errors in big data analysis unless you've got some ferociously keen graduate student or a critic who wants to go in, because you've got masses of data. And picking out spreadsheet, misplacements can be very, very difficult to do. So it lends itself to a kind of trusting attitude. If a data center generated this finding, it's got to be right. Well, not at all necessarily the case. Now, there's also a lesson here. After this paper was shot down, of course, anyone who believed that academic research is treated honestly by the policy community would have to be disabused of that view, because, as we all know, austerity marches on. And whether it's the European Union, rendering Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, etc., high levels of unemployment and cutbacks in services. Greece has essentially shut down its public universities as a result of demands to balance its books. Well, austerity continues. So there is that dimension of it that's kind of a side issue here. The policy community looks for the research that's going to support their positions. Now, there's one other problem I want to address here before talking a little bit about resistance and wrapping up, and that's the issue of labor. This is the kind of image that promoters of the cloud see for the future of work in the cloud, flexible working with cloud computing. Now, in the course of my research, I did find dissidents along the lines of the person who saw the cloud as a bullshit marketing term. Sometimes you find them in think tanks as well, and I found people at Gartner Research, a leading think tank selling its private research to companies. One of whom, looking at the future, made, I think, a very important baseline statement that I think is vital for us to understand. That really the long-run proposition, the value proposition as they like to call it, the money in the cloud, in an IT, is not to support the human workforce, it's to replace it. You don't have to be a Marxist, but Marx argued for the importance in capitalism of replacing living labor with dead labor, replacing humans with technology. Technologies that work 24 hours a day, don't organize unions, don't need pensions, don't receive overtime pay. They just have to be maintained. That coming from a leading private think tank. What about the cloud? Well, business processes, whether it's marketing, finance, legal, etc., will be outsourced to software. So as much of the intelligence that you can embed in software as possible. And there are concerns for emerging economies like that of India, which has placed its bets on outsourcing as a vehicle of economic growth, call centers, etc. Well, if we can outsource to the cloud, what happens to India's role in the global chain of outsourcing? Forbes has announced that we're all outsourcers now, thanks to the cloud. The significance of this is that when we talk about outsourcing, we think of it as something that big companies do. So you outsource your call centers to India, customer relations management to Salesforce. But we're now able to outsource the little things. In fact, you and I can be outsourcers. I will refer in a couple of minutes to the Amazon Mechanical Turk. Amazon's in everything, and it's in the business of networking small jobs through what it calls the Mechanical Turk. So if you want, let's say, a bunch of pages of colors identified, and you don't have the data processing capability of doing it, and a human being can do it more quickly and more cheaply, you go to the Mechanical Turk, you put your job online, someone bids on it, and it could be anyone in the world because it's all online, and you get the job done. That's outsourcing. Of course, term papers have been outsourced for many years, but this is a form of legal and legitimate outsourcing. So again, to Gartner, CIOs believe that their data centers, their servers, their desktop and business applications are grossly inefficient and can be rationalized. What does this mean? Well, why do we need a system where every company, every organization, every university has its own IT department? We can get rid of them and move them to the cloud, and likely that is what will happen. The view is it's more efficient, more effective, produces more value. Whether it's more secure, more private, is a whole other issue. So there are significant labor issues. The research is beginning to demonstrate as companies in all sorts of businesses eliminate or streamline their IT departments, that they could save between, at least at this point, 15 and 20% on their IT costs. So you wonder why York is moving to the cloud. Well, it's a saving. And, now we might say that universities should care about more things than just saving money. Well, tell that to your administration. I haven't had much luck. I remember trying to convince my dean at Queens when I was working there 3 years ago that they shouldn't outsource our email to, I think it was Microsoft, or it might have been Google, because our email as faculty, as students, would be subject to the Patriot Act in the United States when they're stored on US servers. And the dean said, well, he's had assurances from consultants who say it won't be. And this is the standard thing you hear. Savings, cost savings. Now, I think what's vital, and I don't mean to sound all too doom and gloomy, but I think it's important for us to stare the truth in the face before we move beyond. We are all involved in IT work now. That this is not just about computer scientists and software engineers. I mean, in a sense, we produce, process, and distribute information. So in a sense, we are all IT people. Now, if you can streamline, rationalize, reduce to dead labor what IT people do, well, the same promise is held out for us too. So this is a promotional piece of research suggesting the cost savings in automating knowledge work, and you may not be able to see this, but they identify key applications. Smart learning in education. Now they call it smart learning, you know, that's probably a euphemism for massive open online courses that can eliminate faculty and do it automatically. Healthcare diagnostics, drug discovery. In the law, discovery contracts. In finance, they don't identify marketing, but most any occupation that makes use of the production and distribution, storage of information is subject to some degree, and in some places very heavy automation. And the cloud and big data enable this. So one prognosticator suggests that analytic systems will replace in 40 years what most knowledge workers do today. I don't know if that will be the case. I don't have as much faith as Dignan does in the potential of technology, but you know, that may very well be the case. So what happens? See, and because there's no public role in the development of the cloud and big data, there is very little discussion and debate among citizens around these issues. Now, I spent a week at a conference. I spent $2,500 to attend. I heard nothing about the environment, nothing about privacy and surveillance, nothing about labor issues, and certainly nothing about the growing concentration of private power in control of the cloud and big data, and nothing about the NSA. What I learned was how you can buy into the cloud, how you can adapt it to your business, how the cloud can serve you. So where is the public debate around this? Well, there isn't, and as a result, after they upload your desk, file cabinet, and artificial plant, you're next. Additionally, the cloud and big data enable deepening surveillance. This is not just about replacing workers, it's about extending deeper control over them. And back in the 1980s, I did research on Bell Canada and the way they were beginning to develop systems of surveillance in the workplace, counting keystrokes, monitoring telephone calls, counting how long it took an operator or a directory assistance, remember those people, directory assistance operator to complete a transaction with a customer. Well, this is deepened and accelerated with the cloud and big data as workers wear sensors and Amazon counts the number of steps you take to go from one place in a warehouse to another and presents you with the data on how it is that you're taking longer to move a box than your coworker is. And this all happens at Amazon warehouses, or what it calls its fulfillment centers. There aren't many workers feeling fulfilled at these centers, as Amazon pays a minimum wage and uses surveillance on pretty well anything it can measure in its warehouses. Simon Head's book is an important one on this, Mindless: Why Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans. And finally, we'll get to Starbucks. I mentioned the baristas earlier in my talk. When you combine the cloud and big data, Starbucks gathers data on traffic flows in its shops and examines these by day and time. So it knows day by day who's coming in, how large the lines are, how many people are being served at particular points in time, and it's now using these to manage the workplace. So you're a single mom, you need, however precarious, however low paid, your barista job, you arrange for childcare because you know you've been working every Monday afternoon, every Wednesday afternoon. Starbucks comes to you and say, well, traffic flows from our analysis have changed. We want you in Tuesday morning. And you say, but I've arranged childcare. Well, change your arrangement. This is essentially what people are being told across the retail industry. Some of you may have been subject to this, where big data allows precision in managing traffic flows and thereby enables greater precision in managing workers who are treated essentially like machines who can come to work whenever management determines. Now, what's interesting is that workers are fighting back in all of this, and I think we need to acknowledge that Starbucks workers and others are coming together to protest this, to the point where the New York Times ran a story about Starbucks and KFC around big data uses. Now, the point to keep in mind in all of this is that the cloud is part of a global network of chains of accumulation. There's profit in the cloud. These are economic networks linking corporations that produce, distribute, exchange goods and services of all sorts, increasingly managed through sophisticated logistics programs in the cloud. How to get those Foxconn produced chips into the store on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan requires a global network that is increasingly managed in the cloud. Frost and Sullivan, leading private consultants, argue that it will reduce your supply chain risks. I mean, it's difficult to operate a global corporate network. And so risk reduction is vital. And if you can manage your cloud with precision, you can extend control. Now, the cloud can do a lot, but it can't do this. It can't manage the risk involved at a Foxconn plant when workers are committing suicide by jumping off the tops of buildings. And that's an image of how Foxconn chose to deal with the problem, producing suicide prevention nets that it strung across its manufacturing plants around Foxconn to deter workers from jumping off the buildings. Now, hours, pay, regimentation. Foxconn uses child labor. It uses high school students who are told they will be interns, get course credit to work free at Foxconn plants when demands for that iPhone 6 skyrocket. And there have been many cases of workers reaching the end of their line and choosing to end their lives. The cloud can't manage that risk, and it's a form of protest, however extraordinary, that is also part of the system. This is a Foxconn plant in Shenzhen where workers went on a wildcat strike. The pace of work grew so difficult for them to bear that they simply rushed out into the streets and faced the police. Now, I spend a fair bit of time in China, and I've observed on the ground some of these activities. And it's interesting to see it at the point of production. What we receive here in the West is only a fraction of what is happening in China, as well as in other places. We have some insight into Hong Kong today because its media are a bit more open. But the reality is China is in an upheaval, in part because companies believe that they can manage their supply chains like machines and treat every person as a cog in the machinery that produces value for its shareholders. So chains of resistance are beginning to emerge. This is an interesting quote I found in, of all places, Time magazine in an interview with a Shenzhen worker. Think of our image of workers in China today, and here's someone who's saying communism is what we are looking forward to. That is so drenched in irony, I'll just leave it. Unless government takes greater action to improve their welfare, they say laborers will become more and more willing to take action themselves. And they are across the country. So these are the beginnings, the churning of chains of resistance. This is a powerful image. In June, I lectured on this subject in Wuhan, China. And one of my friends in Wuhan, a very large city, kind of considered it would be the Chicago of China, in the middle of the country, extensive industrial and now post-industrial development, which requires rapid expansion of the electrical grid, which means there's constant production of power that is disturbing districts and neighborhoods across the city. So this is maybe tangentially related to the cloud, but I think important enough that I share it with you. This is in broad daylight, wide open. A stream of cars moving down a highway with a sign that says, "We are giving you this inflatable doll so you don't have to rape our will." And this is in protest for the development of an electrical substation. Now, if this can happen in one place under an authoritarian government, imagine chains of resistance. And I'll give a plug to a book by one of my recent PhDs, Jianhua Yao, who's a courageous young man who lives in Shanghai. His day job, ironically enough, is to teach party cadres the workings of the bureaucracy. But off the books, he has rewritten his doctoral dissertation about resistance and upheaval in China's publishing industry, demonstrating what it is for media workers in China who face the twin pressures of one, government censorship and propaganda, and two, the drive to make profit for newly privatized media firms in the country. How do they manage these demands, often contradictory and full of high pressure and stress? So I credit Jianhua for this work. Now we're seeing this elsewhere. This is India, the new trade union initiative, which is trying to bring together information workers, technology workers, linking call center workers with software engineers. Another student of mine, Andrew Stevens, who finished his PhD under my direction, has did his field work in India and has written about resistance, chains of resistance in that country. Call Centers and the Global Division of Labor is his book. I'm enormously proud. Back to the Amazon Mechanical Turk. Even there, protest is developing. There's an organization called Turk Opticon. All right, what does Mechanical Turk do? And essentially tries to find the lowest possible price of labor anywhere in the world to do a small task. Until Turkers got together and formed an organization called Turk Opticon, which exists online, it's worldwide, and it provides information, ideas, strategies, contract language, information on good employers and wretched employers, what to demand and pay. How do you repair a broken system that isn't yours to repair? You organize and you fight for it. Now, if they can do this in the digital sweatshops in the world, well, perhaps chains of resistance are not out of the question. And then there are traditional unions. Since we don't talk much about unions anymore anywhere, I think it's important to make reference to them. The Union Network International is a global federation of unions that represent workers in journalism, media, IT, and services around the world, developing opportunities to negotiate and fight transnational businesses on a more level playing field. A global union is needed to deal with global companies, and they are emerging. Verdi is another one. It's based in Germany. Again, Amazon. Jeff Bezos' goal is to make Amazon union-free, to pay as many workers the bare minimum it can get away with, to fire whenever it chooses to. Well, German unions don't stand by when Amazon comes to Germany, an important market for the company. And in fact, a year ago, workers in Leipzig launched the first strike ever anywhere in the world against Amazon. And they're on the picket line right now because Amazon refuses to pay recognized decent wages, refuses to respect wage and hour laws, and in general refuses to talk to workers in any relationship other than management to dead labor. So Verdi took to the streets. There's more and more of this. The United States is the home of the Communication Workers of America. You might hear in your courses about convergence, technological convergence, technologies coming together, perhaps in the cloud, companies coming together to form global organizations that converge. Well, unions are doing the same thing. And the Communication Workers of America now represent journalists, telecom workers, service workers. They are the union for the information age, as is Unifor here in Canada. A union you probably should get to know better because quite likely if you're a media student, you may be a member of before you know it, and it's good to understand what it is and what it does. Hollywood workers emerged victorious in the last year when, after 60 or 70 years of existence, the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists merged to form one big union in Hollywood to better face off against the Hollywood majors. And in fact, they signed their first contract with the majors, the first time in history that the big Hollywood companies weren't able to play one union off against another in contract negotiations because there's only one union in town. And finally, and I'll wrap up with this, there are new worker organizations emerging, including the Freelancers Union, started in New York City by a 20-something-year-old woman, fully committed to providing services to the growing precarious workforce of writers, journalists, knowledge workers who hope to make a living from their craft and from their skill, but who are no longer able to because they've been reduced to the precarity of the digital workforce. And the Freelancers Union, now boasting 200,000 members, represents them with model contracts, with insurance, with advice, with counseling, and leading the fight against some of the big communication companies. And I love the philosophy of Sarah Horowitz. She was the founder. I don't know that she's 30 years old yet. She might be in her 30s. She says the social unionism of the 1920s had it right. They said, we serve workers 360 degrees. It's not just about their work, it's about their whole life. We view things the same way. For worker organizations to succeed, we're going to have to acknowledge that baristas have lives at home, that Amazon workers don't devote all of their time to serving Jeff Bezos. But the question this leaves me with, and we come back to the public issue, is can the social unionism of organizations like the Freelancers and others like it help build a movement that turns cloud computing into a genuine public utility that serves democracy? Will it turn the private cloud, that is in essence the cloud we all have today, into a democratic public cloud that is used for citizenship and democracy and that we all control for ourselves? And I thank you.